First of all, it is great to see so many people excited about sawfish and the Fitzroy River. Because we always assume that people know nothing about sawfish, and for the most part, actually, people know fairly little about sawfish. But hopefully today, you're going to walk away with knowing a fair bit more about them, and also so you can appreciate why we care about the Fitzroy. And if we care about sawfish, we have to care about the Fitzroy. Now, with every science project, there are so many people behind this work, and I'm really a part of it. Karissa, which is going to talk after me, she's a PhD student at Murdoch, so I won't reintroduce her or her work anymore because she can talk about that herself. Then on the right, we have Dave Morgan, and Dave really is the catalyst for all of this. So Dave has been going up to the Fitzroy for nearly 20 years, and I think Dave has definitely left a piece of himself in that country. And you know, when Dave talks about it, you can see it's really part of who he is now. And Dave has basically has realised that the Fitzroy is very important for sawfish, not just for us in Western Australia, but globally. And so Dave really has documented all that biodiversity along both the Kimberley and the Murdoch coast as far as fishes go, and especially sawfish. And really only his work has gotten us to the point where people like myself have come in over the last 5-6 years to work on these animals. Whereas previously we simply wouldn't have been able to do it. So, you know, this is really sort of the core of our research group, but there are lots of other people that contribute to this. And Karissa will also talk about that in a second, about Team Sawfish. Now, sawfish. Sawfish are really crazy animals. I'm sure everyone will agree. I mean, you just look at them and they just look a little out of place, don't they? Because they're just so ancient looking, you know? I mean, they've been around since the Cretaceous. So literally, you know, like dinosaurs were roaming the earth, you know, your Tyrannosaurus rex and your other carnivorous dinosaurs were roaming the earth at the same time as these animals. And yeah, modern sawfish, is like we don't say, also looking very similar to the animals we have today, have been around for 60 million years. Think about this. There were no, you know, I mean, we were literally tiny, scurrying rats at the time, when you think about mammals. So, you know, they have an incredibly evolutionary history. And the other thing, of course, is that people often confuse sawfish and saw sharks and also swordfish. But so sawfish, or sawfishes, they actually rays. So even though we call them a shark-like batoid, which is a terrible name, but really what they are is they are a ray that disguises like a shark. So they have a tail like a shark, but you know they're a ray because they're flattened, sort of dorso-ventrally flattened. And they have their gill slits, which is what they use for their respiration, on the underside of their body, which you can see on that bottom image. Whereas a saw shark is actually a shark, and that has gill slits on the side of its body. So even though both these sort of groups of animals have evolved this, you know, rostrum, right, this teeth-aligned nose, if you will, there's actually millions and millions of years of evolution that divide those two. So even though they look very much alike, evolutionary speaking, they're actually not that much alike at all. But why would you study sawfish? And this is, of course, a question we get asked all the time, because if you spend a good part of your life working on a certain animal, you have to be slightly obsessed with it, just a little bit. And the reason is they're freaking amazing. I mean, just look at that animal. I mean, for me personally, you look at that rostrum of fully grown, large-toothed sawfish, you know, growing upwards of 6 meters, like, you know, Greenie was telling us earlier. So, you know, they're just massive animals, which have all these exceptional adaptations. And as a result, it's hard not to be awestruck when you see one for the first time, even if it's only 80 centimeters long, because they start their life at such a small size. And this is what they... There we go. And this is what these guys look like when they're cruising the shallows. So here we go. Here's one that we've just tagged with Nicolamunda ranges, and there you can see how they're sort of perfectly adapted to swim along the bottom, and with their rostrum, they swim around and they sense the environment. And of course, all of you are probably going to ask me now, what's that thing for? Well, it's actually pretty cool, because not only is it a weapon, which obviously, you know, if you have big teeth, helps as a weapon, but it's also an antenna. So not only can they sense their prey with it, because they have these tiny electrosensitive pores all along it, so they can sense their prey and then they can whack it, immobilize it, and eat it. So it's quite exceptional. So it's basically like an antenna mixed with a sword, if you will. And for a while, people were thinking that they were using it potentially as a rake, to rake through the sediment and sort of find little bivalves, but it turned out that that's not what they do. They just whack their prey really hard. So why study sawfish? You know, when you're trying to ask someone for money to help you support your work, just to say, oh, they're really cool, they're enormous, usually no one's going to come up with many dollars for you to go out and study something. But actually many other good reasons of why we need to study these animals. They're critically endangered. And this is probably a part that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So we have 5 species globally, 4 of those we have in WA. And these are the distributions of all those species globally. And over here you'll see I've basically written down the percentage decline in these species. And that's not that they're 30% less sawfish now. No. What that, for example, means is that for the narrow sawfish, of its entire previous range, in 1/3 it has gone extinct. So for example, in the small-tooth sawfish, we have 81% of the former range where this animal used to occur. It is simply gone from. So if we were to think about that in total numbers of animals, how many have disappeared, it's probably far, far, far greater, probably upwards of 90%. So why have these animals disappeared at such a great rate? So they're generally considered to be the most threatened of all sharks and rays. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The first one is, like most sharks and rays, they live very long, they start reproducing very late, and they have very few young. So that means if your population is declining as a result of fishing or something else, your ability to rebound is quite diminished. But the other problem for these guys is they like to live in the coastal zone or up rivers. Where are human activity is the greatest? In the coastal zone and in rivers. So they tend to interact with people a lot, especially where you have net fisheries. The rostrum also makes sure that basically any sort of net that you put in the waterway is going to catch sawfish quite easily. So they're quite catchable as far as fisheries are concerned. And that has basically resulted in these drastic declines of these animals throughout the world. So here we see, this is a sawfish caught in a net. I think this was up in the Pilbara. So someone had basically just left a gill net, tide dropped out, sawfish was caught in it, water runs out, fish need water, and that's it. Unfortunately also, the saw makes a great curio. Everybody I'm sure up north has seen someone that's got one on their wall. And unfortunately some people don't even have the decency to kill the animal. When you cut their rostrum off, they usually die quite slowly because they simply cannot find enough food to feed themselves. So it's a very, very sad sight. And so this was one documented by Dave Morgan's, the green sawfish in the Pilbara. But actually, there's a lot more records that we're finding now, not just from us, but also from people over east. And then, discarded fishing line, people just leaving up on the bank because they're useless. Because, for example, when the juveniles are around, the juveniles can be everywhere, especially in the Fitzroy River. But unfortunately, people don't necessarily look after them. So, WA. As I said, we have 4 of the 5 species in the northwest. And that's 5 species globally. And most of our research really has been on freshwater and the dwarf sawfish. But also more recently, we've been working a lot more on what's called the green sawfish and the narrow sawfish. We have a representative roster of all of those over there, which I can show you perhaps a bit later. So the dwarf sawfish is a great little name, right? You think it's this tiny little creature, and yes, it's born very small, but this dwarf still grows to about 3.5–4 meters. The dwarfies, they really love that sort of intermediate salinity, so we know them a lot from the tidal pools of King Sound. So they'll come up into the river in the dry season, as the river becomes more saline in its lower reaches, and then they'll leave out with the wet season again. The green sawfish, which is very much marine, but we've also had the first capture of the green sawfish, again in the Fitzroy River in its tidal pools 2 years ago, and we had very poor wet season, and the river got quite saline in those tidal pools. And then here, the freshwater, which is my favorite, and probably the one that's most reliant on the Fitzroy. So the freshwater sawfish, also often known as the large-tooth sawfish, And it's called a freshwater sawfish because it uses freshwater for part of its life cycle. And Greeny's been telling you about that earlier. So the adults will basically come into the river or the estuary, drop their pups, and the pups have a massive affinity for freshwaters. And they will swim up for as long as they can. So they get pupped in the wet when the river's flooded, and those little guys will go upstream, 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 until the water basically drops. Then they'll be stuck, well, I say stuck, I mean they want to be stuck there, in these dry season pools where there's far fewer saltwater crocodiles, the bull sharks are smaller, and they'll live in that environment for five years until they get to a respectable size, still being a juvenile of around 2.6, 2.7 meters for a female, about 2.2, 2.3 meters for a male, and they'll start their maker journey back into the ocean with a wet season where they grow to 6, 7 meters and they get ready to reproduce. What they do out in the ocean, we've got no idea. We don't even know where they go from. We just know that they have a broad distribution globally. But where did the Fitzroy River juvenile sawfish go? No idea. So here you can see this strapping young fellow right there, holding a freshwater sawfish right there. So yeah, as I said, critically endangered, use the Fitzroy as a nursery. And the Fitzroy is really quite an exceptional nursery. So we only find recruitment, so that is when we see lots of juveniles in the river in good wet seasons. So 2016 was a massive wet. And we caught over 200 sawfish in that year. The year previous, when we had 3 bad wet seasons, we caught 3. So there's a strong link between how much water there is in that system and how many juveniles can find them. And yeah, and they can really be, you'd almost call it plague proportions, which is hard to sort of imagine for a critically endangered animal. But the bottom line is it's simply the Fitzroy. Other researchers that work over east, they on average catch we catch on average 100 times more sawfish per unit net, per unit ton that we spend than anyone else does in the world. So if you want, this bit of water, the Fitzroy, is a bit of a Noah's Ark for this species. And who knows, it might actually have massive regional importance throughout the Indo-Pacific, because all these juveniles might disperse out into the open water somewhere else. Right, so we've heard a lot about this great place, the Fitzroy. We're up here, the Western Kimberley. Got King Sound up there, which if you've ever been to King Sound, it's almost your worst nightmare. It looks like chocolate milk, it's full of crocodiles, but there's plenty of barra in it. And if anyone's going to catch a barra out of it, it will be Redmond. When Redmond generally fishes, I don't usually try because he's just going to show me up and catching more fish than I ever could. But here it is, and those are the 2 main sites that we work. So think about this. We have these animals that grow to nearly 3 meters, and we are 50, 150, 250 kilometers from the ocean. Right? So these animals really go far, far upriver. Recently, actually, one was caught in Northern Territory, 600 kilometers from the ocean, upriver. And that's a marine fish. And this is what the river looks like. The river's really seasonal, right? We have a dry season where the river contracts, and we'll have what we call refuge pools. Because once the big wet, the monsoonal wet runs through, surface water runs off, and we're left with these little pools. And this is what they can look like. This is here just downstream of the Cambalin Barrage, which is a leftover of Jack Fletcher's irrigation project. So this bit of water here is probably only 70, 80 meters by 30 or 40 meters. We caught 8 bull sharks in that particular year. So, these pools are full of life, and they can sustain relatively high numbers of predators. And then this is what it looks like in the wet. It turns into a torrent. Big wet, and the floodplain, the water will run up onto the floodplains, and the fish probably go with it. And with that flood, you have all the good nutrients that are sitting out on the land. They get washed back into the river and start at productivity. That's what these animals live on. There's flood hulls. The flood draws the nutrients into the main river channel. Then the dry season comes along, and all that productivity now has to last until the next wet season, which may only last 3 months. Sometimes it's maybe a few weeks at a time. So this is the river, and probably early dry season, the year with a strong wet season. So yeah, so it's monsoonal. And then what we basically have with water in the dry season is dependent on rain from the wet and the groundwater recharge. Okay, so the land acts like a sponge. As the rain stops, surface water runs off. That water from the land drains back into the river and maintains these refuges. So another beautiful picture, just one of our favorite camp spots, this one. Yeah, so we've got heaps of sawfish right off that little sandy point there. We often get a few. And I mean, what a view, isn't it? It's just a beautiful place. Brendan's probably just explaining what the best snag is to catch a barra. This here is again the Kambalin Barrage. This is 2011 in June. This is a good wet. This has been a good wet. So see, there's plenty of water coming over this. Great fishing. And then I'm going to show you the next picture now is taken from almost exactly the same place, 2016, after 3 bad wet seasons. So it shows you just how different that environment can be from one year to the next. It's almost not recognizable. So this is what it looks like looking towards the barrage from downstream. Yeah, so I mean that's also in October, so of course it's an extreme case, but you know, 3-4 years of poor wet seasons, of poor flooding of the system has a dramatic effect. So you can think about what that might mean for damming the system or changing the hydrology in some ways. Then of course also those shallows get really hot, over 35 degrees Celsius in those shallow areas, so even warmer. And the area is also supposed to change quite a bit under climate change. So we might see another 5-6 degrees Celsius on top of 35 degrees Celsius. And one of the big problems, of course, is that the increasing proposition of land development, which might extract further water in the system. That already at times is water limited, and more importantly, if it gets hotter, we're going to have more evaporation, and we're going to have less water again. So when we think about climate change and the allocation of water, I think it turns into an even more complicated issue than is perhaps even recognized. So, what does this mean for sawfish? And that's where I'm going to hand over to Karissa, who's going to talk about team sawfish and the kind of science that we're trying to do to try and answer some of these questions. And again, this unfortunately predates you, Greenie, so you're not on yet. But well, we've got Raymond in there, don't we? All right, so Karissa.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to talk about team sawfish and the research we're doing on the Fitzroy, try to understand these animals a little bit better. So team sawfish has been working in Fitzroy for over 15 years, led mostly by Murdoch. It's a collaboration between researchers from Murdoch, Adrian, myself, and Dave, and the Nicola Rangers and other ranger groups, these two. And what we do is go out to the river and study all sorts of things about sawfish, try to understand how they use the river, and just really anything about them because so little is known about these animals. So from behavior, population dynamics, movement patterns, all sorts of things. And we have a lot of different methods we use to study these things, but mostly use a bunch of different types of tagging techniques. So one of the things we do is called conventional tagging or ID tagging. Where we go out, we set our nets, we catch a bunch of fish, we take all sorts of measurements that Nathan was talking about, measure how long they are, how wide they are down the middle, take a weight, and we record all that, and then we give them an ID tag, this little orange tag that has a number on it, and we release the fish. And then when we capture that fish, either later the same year or in 6 years later, we can see how much it's grown, how, and compare its body condition. So if it's gotten fatter or skinnier, and look at how the wet season that year has affected that as well. So we can learn a lot about just how healthy the sawfish populations are in the river, how many sawfish are in the river, and those sorts of things. So for example, this is some data we have where the black dots there are all sawfish caught in the early dry season, when there's usually a lot of water in the river and temperatures are cool. And the white dots are in the late dry season. And you can see these comparisons of the weight of the sawfish and the girth, so how fat they are. And all of the sawfish in the early dry season, basically much fatter than the sawfish in the late dry season. So when they get stuck in these pools for months at a time, they get longer, so they have a positive length growth rate, but they actually get skinnier. So they weigh less at the end of the season, even though they're bigger, than they did at the beginning. So it tells a lot about just how the river works and how the sawfish have to deal with being stuck in these pools. So that's one thing to do, is this ID tagging. We also do a lot of acoustic tagging. We have some tags and a receiver down here too that you can come look at the end. So acoustic tagging, basically these tags that look a little like a battery, communicate to the receivers, which is this black thing here. So we place these receivers throughout the river, and we implant these tags in the little belly of the fish. So sharks and sawfish have something called tonic immobility. When you flip them on their back, they go to sleep. Pretty handy. So we flip them over, they go to sleep. We put a tag just underneath the skin, sew it back up, and let the fish go. And then every time they swim past a receiver, they'll give us different information, like where they are in the river, sometimes what depth they're at, how hot the river is, how hot their body temperature is, and how much they're moving as well. So we can get a lot of information about how they're using different pools in the river and different areas within those pools. And that can be really helpful in telling us which habitats are important for sawfish. So for example, these are all the pools again that we work in, and all of our receivers that are in the river. And we've learned that sawfish during the day like to sit under snags in the deep, cool areas of the river and just rest. They don't move very much. And then at night, they become active and they go into these shallow areas called glides, where there's water moving over shallow bits of the river off the sandbars to hunt for fish. So all of the bait fish and the cherubim and different things like to hang out in those places too. So it tells us a lot about how sawfish use different habitats in the river and which habitats are really important to make sure that they're successful. We also have been starting to do some smart tagging of sawfish using accelerometers. And if you guys haven't heard of accelerometers, most of you probably have one on you right now. It's actually the same technology that's in your smartphone or Fitbit or a Nintendo Wii controller, any of those smart movement devices. So when you have your smartphone and you flip it horizontally or vertically and the picture changes, that's actually the accelerometer inside the phone telling the phone that it flipped. So accelerometers are movement sensors. They measure this three-dimensional movement. And they work the same way when you put them on the fish. They look a little bit different, about like that. And they can measure really detailed movements of the fish, three-dimensional movements. So whether the fish is pitched up or down in the water, or rolled from side to side. We can see every tail beat the fish makes, just like a Fitbit will track footsteps all day long. You can track tail beats of fish all day long. So you can find out a lot about the fish behavior and what they're doing without actually having to observe or track them. So this is just an example of some accelerometer data from a white shark, actually. It works the same for a sawfish. So the black on top is the depth. This is a white shark doing a 40-meter dive and coming back up again. The red line is pitch. So you can see the change in pitch as the white shark goes down and then comes back up, the pitch shifts. So we get that information. And then the blue down here is tail beats. So sharks are negatively buoyant, meaning they sink. So when they're going down in the water, they don't really have to swim. They can just glide down. And then, so that's that small line in the first part. And then the second line, all of that up and down movement is each tail beat the fish is making. So you can see that they have to kick a lot harder to get up in the water than to go down. So we can figure out different things like this using the accelerometers, just how they're moving in the water. So we can ask a bunch of different questions. We can figure out when are sawfish active, when are they feeding, how much are they feeding, where do they like to rest, where do they like to feed, and how might all of these things change when river temperature changes or when different other parameters change. So basically, we're trying to figure out what they're doing. So if you want to figure out what your sawfish is doing at 3 o'clock in the morning, just stick an accelerometer on it. May not work as well for children. I've not tried it. So before we put these tags out in the wild, we have to do some work in the lab. That's basically like making a Fitbit for So if any of you have a Fitbit, and you walk or run or you cycle, when you go into the little Fitbit app, it can tell you, oh, you walked for 40 minutes, then you ran for 30 minutes, and then you cycled, just depending on the different movements that that sensor reads. So we can do the same thing for sawfish. We can figure out when they're resting, when they're swimming, when they're burst swimming, and when they're feeding, because all of those movements have slightly different patterns. But we have to figure out what those patterns are. So we, with the help of Nathan and Raymond and some other rangers, took a couple sawfish into captivity last year and kept them in broom for a few months. Stuck a bunch of tags on them and showed them what we fed them, basically, and they did other behaviors, so we can match that behavior. So I have a couple videos for you. This is so the bottom is those three lines there is the output the accelerometer gives us, that three-dimensional movement. So this is from that fish sitting right in front. You can see it resting for a minute in front. It's going to go after this piece of fish. It is just a piece of dead fish, but might as well whack it for good measure. So that's what sawing or feeding would look like on the accelerometer. So that's one of the behaviors we were looking for. Here's another one. Sawfish get itchy too sometimes. And that's how they deal with it, because they don't have hands and itching with the rocks around them. Very complicated and probably painful. So that's what that trace looks like. So we can match all of these different behaviors that sawfish do with what the accelerometer gives us. And then I can put these accelerometer tags out on wild sawfish and figure out exactly when they're feeding, how much they're feeding them, and get a lot of information about their behavior. So that's the first part of it, making a sawfish Fitbit. And the second part is figuring out how much energy do all of these different movements take. So to do that, I put my sawfish in this tank and sealed it off to measure how much oxygen they use, how quickly they use oxygen, and that tells us how much energy they use, what their metabolic rate is, or how many calories they're using. So I did this at a bunch of different temperatures. Sawfish are ectotherms, or they're cold-blooded animals, which means they can't control their own body temperature. And so their body temperature is the same as whatever water they're swimming around in. And that means when the water gets warmer, their body gets warmer, and it takes a lot more energy just to regulate normal function. So they use a lot more energy in warmer water. They actually use almost twice as much energy, just over 10 degrees difference in temperature, just to do their normal body functions. So I did that as well, and then I can take my tag data from the wild sawfish and apply those conversions. So this is just an quick example of about how much energy these sawfish are using, quite a few sawfish, over the dry season. So you can see a gradual increase in energy as temperature increases throughout these months, and then that daily back and forth of if a sawfish is more active one day, it's going to use more energy and less the next. So that's just an estimate of how much energy they're using in the wild. So that information can be really helpful in helping us understand how the sawfish are interacting with their ecosystem, how many fish they would need to eat, knowing if that is possible in the river in different years, or maybe not possible, and that's why they get skinnier as the dry season goes on, because they can't sustain those energy demands. So that brings us back to what Adrian was talking about earlier, that the Fitzroy is undercut from climate change and also these land use measures. So the top picture, top left picture over there, is what the river is like right now. It has the hot water on the top that's warmed by the sun, and these nice, cool, deep areas that the sawfish can rest in during the day. But say we take water out of the river, you just sort of lower that amount of water. So there's less cool refuges and less space for the sawfish to go in between different habitats as well. And then say you increase the temperature, the whole thing, whole temperature throughout the water column is going to increase. So you have more warm temperatures, might still have deep areas where the water is going to be a lot hotter. So you still lose those cool refuges. But say you take water out of the river, and climate change makes water hotter, and suddenly you've lost your cool places for the sawfish to rest, and you're much more in the red zone, as it were, with all of the water being hot. It's stagnant. There's not river flow, so the water is just sitting, and the oxygen doesn't mix well through the water. So that's really what we're trying to figure out now, is using these timing techniques to see if climate change and land use are going to affect sawfish, and maybe they'll increase starvation in young of the year sawfish because the hotter water is going to make the sawfish require a lot more energy that may or may not be there. So the bottom line with all of this is just that in the Fitzroy, water is life, as Adrian was saying, and the water flowing through this river isn't wasted. It doesn't just sit there unused. It supports this huge body of life of sawfish and barramundi and crocodiles and people, communities, everything. So it's a really incredible place, and we hope that our research will help inform management, and we can know how to protect this better. So thank you to a huge number of people. This work has been funded by a bunch of different people over the years. Also a special thank you to the Ninkla Rangers who make it all possible, give us a lot of help on